The Louisiana Bloodbath, the nun who slaughtered 9 men over a stolen rosary. The humid Louisiana air hung heavy over St. Augustine's Church in New Orleans' French Quarter, where Sister Margaret Beaumont knelt in prayer before the morning mass. Her weathered hands clutched a rosary that had belonged to her mother, the wooden beads smooth from decades of devotion. At 62 years old, Margaret had spent 40 years serving God, teaching children and providing comfort to the dying. Her fellow sisters knew her as gentle, patient, and unwavering in her faith. The other nuns would often comment on how Margaret never raised her voice, never showed frustration, never displayed anything but serene acceptance of whatever trials God placed before her. That Tuesday morning in August started like any other. The church bells chimed at 6, calling the faithful to prayer. Margaret rose from her narrow bed in the convent, dressed in her habit, and made her way across the courtyard to the chapel. The streets outside were already alive with the sounds of the quarter, jazz music drifting from Bourbon Street, the clatter of delivery trucks on cobblestones, and the sweet scent of beignets from Café du Monde mixing with the earthy smell of the Mississippi River just blocks away. New Orleans was waking up to another sweltering summer day, the kind where the air felt thick enough to swim through, and the pavement would be hot enough to fry an egg by noon. Margaret had always loved this city, even with its chaos and sin happening just beyond the convent walls. She'd been born here in Charity Hospital, back when it was still operating. She'd grown up in the Tremé neighborhood, in a small shotgun house with her parents and 3 brothers. Her mother, Evangeline, had been a cafeteria worker at Tulane University. Her father, Robert, had worked on the docks until an accident with a crane took his life when Margaret was just 16. That tragedy had pushed her mother deeper into her Catholic faith, and young Margaret had followed, finding solace in prayer when the world seemed too cruel and unpredictable. Before we continue with Margaret's story, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below letting me know your city or country, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear more true stories like this one. Now let's get back to what happened that fateful morning. After morning prayers, Margaret returned to her room to retrieve her lesson plans for the day's religious education classes. She taught children aged 7 to 12 about the sacraments, the lives of saints, and the importance of prayer. She was known for her patience with even the most difficult students, the ones who fidgeted and asked endless questions and tested the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Margaret never lost her temper. She would simply smile, redirect them gently, and continue with her lessons. She reached into the small wooden box on her nightstand, where she always kept her mother's rosary, but her fingers found only empty space. Her heart quickened. She checked again, lifting the lid completely, searching every corner of the box. Nothing. The rosary was gone. Margaret felt a cold wave wash over her body, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. It was fear mixed with something else, something darker that she couldn't quite name. Margaret's mother, Evangeline Beaumont, had died 23 years earlier, after a long battle with ovarian cancer. During those final months, Margaret had taken a leave of absence from her teaching duties to care for her mother. She'd held her mother's hand through chemotherapy sessions that left Evangeline weak and nauseated. She'd changed her mother's bedsheets when the sickness became too much. She'd read scripture aloud when her mother couldn't sleep because of the pain. And through it all, they'd prayed together using that rosary. Evangeline had received the rosary from her own mother on her wedding day in 1960. It had been hand-carved by Margaret's great-grandfather, a carpenter who'd emigrated from France in the early 1900s. He'd made it from wood taken from an old oak tree that had stood in their family's courtyard for generations. The crucifix was pewter, cast by a local metalworker who attended their parish. It wasn't valuable in any monetary sense. You couldn't pawn it for more than a few dollars. But it represented 5 generations of Beaumont family faith, prayers whispered in French and English, fingers worn smooth by countless Hail Marys. On her deathbed at Oxner Medical Center, Evangeline had pressed that rosary into Margaret's palm with trembling fingers. Her mother's voice had been barely a whisper, weakened by the morphine and the cancer eating away at her body. Keep this close. Margaret, it's carried our family through wars, floods, and heartbreak. It will keep you strong. Promise me you'll never let it go. Margaret had promised. She'd clutched that rosary during her mother's funeral at St. Louis Cathedral, the beads slick with her tears. She'd held it during the burial at St. Louis Cemetery No. 3, watching as her mother's casket was placed in the family tomb. For 23 years that rosary had never left her possession. She prayed with it every morning and every night. It was her connection to her mother, to her ancestors, to a family history that extended back across an ocean and through generations of struggle and faith. And now it was gone. Margaret felt her chest tighten as panic set in. She searched her entire room methodically, checking under the bed, in her wardrobe, between the pages of her prayer books, in every drawer and corner and crevice. Nothing. She pulled back her mattress, checked her shoes, emptied her pockets. The rosary had vanished. Someone had been in her room. Someone had violated her private space and taken the most precious thing she owned. She went to Sister Catherine, the head of their small convent community. Catherine was a stern woman in her 70s, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a nun for 52 years and had seen the convent through hurricanes, floods, and the chaos of post-Katrina New Orleans. She ran the community with an iron will tempered by genuine compassion for her sisters. "Sister Catherine, I need to report something," Margaret said, her voice shaking slightly. "My mother's rosary is missing from my room." Catherine looked up from the accounts ledger she'd been reviewing, her expression immediately concerned. "When did you last see it?" "Last night, before bed. I prayed with it, as I always do, then placed it in the box on my nightstand. I've done the same thing every single night for 23 years. This morning it was gone. Could you have misplaced it elsewhere? Perhaps you set it down somewhere and forgot?" "No," Margaret insisted, her voice firmer now. "I never deviate from that routine. Never. Someone took it from my room." Sister Catherine's expression grew more serious. She set down her pen and folded her hands on the desk. "We had workers here yesterday afternoon. The Archdiocese sent contractors to repair the leak in the chapel roof. Some of them may have been in the convent building to access the attic space. I supervised them as much as I could, but there were moments when I had to attend to other duties." Margaret felt a cold dread settle into her stomach. Strangers had been in the building. Men she didn't know. Men who had no connection to their community. Men who might see a simple rosary as something to pocket without a second thought. Who were these workers? What company? Rodrigo's construction company. They've done work for several parishes in the area. The Archdiocese recommended them. Catherine stood up, her face set with determination. "I'll contact the company immediately. This is unacceptable. Our home should be a place of safety and trust." Over the next 2 days, Sister Catherine made numerous calls to Rodrigo's construction company. The owner, a man named Rodrigo Martinez, was dismissive and defensive from the very first conversation. He was a second-generation immigrant who'd built his business from nothing, working brutal hours to establish himself in New Orleans' competitive construction market. He employed mostly Latino workers, many of them relatives or friends from his hometown in Honduras. He was protective of his crew and didn't appreciate accusations from anyone, especially not nuns. "My men don't steal," he told Catherine over the phone, his voice hard and insulted. "They're professionals. They're good people. Maybe your sister just lost her beads. Old people misplace things all the time." Catherine's voice remained calm but firm. "They were taken from a locked room, Mr. Martinez. Sister Margaret is not forgetful. She's kept that rosary in the same place for over 2 decades. We need you to question your workers. Ask if anyone saw anything or accidentally took something they shouldn't have. Lady, I got a business to run. I can't be accusing my guys of stealing every time some nun loses her jewelry. You got any proof it was my workers? Any witnesses? Any cameras?" "We don't have security cameras in the convent. We've never needed them. We trust that people will respect sacred spaces." Rodrigo laughed. A harsh sound. "Well, maybe that trust was misplaced. But I'm telling you, my guys didn't take nothing. Check your own people first. Maybe one of the other nuns wanted some nice prayer beads." The insult hung in the air. Catherine's hand tightened on the phone receiver. "Mr. Martinez, I'm asking you as a fellow Christian to please help us. This rosary has tremendous sentimental value. It's been in Sister Margaret's family for generations. We're not interested in pressing charges or causing trouble for your business. We just want it returned. And I'm telling you, I can't help you. My guys didn't take it. End of story." The line went dead. Margaret stood nearby during this conversation, listening to Catherine's increasingly frustrated tone. She could hear the contempt in Rodrigo's voice even from across the room. When Catherine hung up, Margaret saw the anger flash across the older nun's face, something she rarely witnessed. "He refuses to cooperate," Catherine said, her voice tight with restrained fury. "He won't even ask his workers about it. He treats this as if we're making false accusations to damage his business." She took a deep breath, composing herself. "I'm going to contact the police. This is theft, pure and simple." Margaret nodded, but inside something was shifting. Something dark and cold was spreading through her chest, like ice forming on a winter pond. She had devoted her entire adult life to turning the other cheek, to forgiveness, to the teachings of Christ about mercy and compassion. But this wasn't just about a stolen object. This was about her mother's memory being desecrated. This was about the violation of their sacred space. This was about men who had no respect for what was holy, who saw a rosary as just another trinket to pocket or throw away. That night Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every moment with her mother. She remembered being a girl of 12, kneeling beside Evangeline in this very church, learning to pray the rosary for the first time. Her mother's voice had been soft and melodic, reciting the Hail Mary with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." She remembered her mother's hands, work-roughened from years of cafeteria labor, holding those beads with such gentleness and reverence. She remembered the rosary at her father's funeral, her mother clutching it so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She remembered her mother teaching her brothers to pray, though they'd all drifted away from the faith as adults. She remembered the feel of those wooden beads passing through her fingers during her mother's funeral, the only thing keeping her grounded as they lowered the casket into the earth. And now some stranger had it, some man who'd seen it lying in her room and thought nothing of taking it. He probably didn't even know what he'd stolen. He probably thought it was just costume jewelry, something worth a few dollars at a pawn shop. Or maybe he'd already thrown it away, tossed it in a dumpster, because it had no value to him. Margaret felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 40 years, rage, pure, white-hot rage that burned through her chest and made her hands shake. For 40 years, she'd swallowed every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being treated as if her thoughts and feelings didn't matter. She'd been told that anger was a sin, that good Catholic women didn't raise their voices or make demands. She'd been trained to be meek, mild, forgiving, selfless. She'd buried her own needs so deep that she'd almost forgotten they existed, but she remembered them now. She remembered being 17 years old and wanting to scream at God for taking her father. She remembered being 22 and wanting to hit the man who'd groped her on the streetcar. She remembered being 30 and wanting to throw her superior's condescending words back in her face. She remembered being 39 and wanting to rage at the doctors who couldn't save her mother. 40 years of suppressed anger, bubbling up like pressure in a sealed container, looking for a crack to escape through. By Thursday morning, the police had done a cursory investigation. Officer James Dupree, a bored-looking man in his 40s with a coffee stain on his uniform shirt, came to the convent to take their statement. He barely looked at Margaret as she described the rosary and when it had gone missing. He scribbled a few notes in a pad, asked if there were any witnesses or security footage, and basically told them there was little chance of recovery. "Look, sisters, I hate to say it, but these construction sites, guys come and go. Could have been anyone working that day. Could have been pawned already, sold to some tourist on Jackson Square, thrown in the trash because they didn't know what it was. Without witnesses or cameras, there's nothing we can do. File an insurance claim if you have coverage." Margaret had listened to this with growing disbelief. "An insurance claim? Officer, this isn't about money. This rosary has been in my family for 5 generations. It's irreplaceable." Dupree had shrugged, already heading for the door. "I understand it's got sentimental value, ma'am, but we got murders and robberies to deal with. A missing rosary just ain't high priority. You want my advice? Buy a new one and move on. Dwelling on it ain't healthy." Margaret watched him leave, feeling something dark and unfamiliar coiling in her chest, like a snake preparing to strike. The system had failed her. The company had dismissed her. The police offered no hope, and somewhere out there a man walked free with her mother's rosary, probably oblivious to what he'd stolen, treating it like trash or pocket change. Sister Catherine noticed the change in Margaret's demeanor over the following days. The younger nun had always been so composed, so peaceful. But now there was a tension in her shoulders, a hardness in her eyes that Catherine had never seen before. Margaret went through her daily routines, teaching classes, preparing meals, attending prayers, but she seemed distant, distracted, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. "I know this is difficult," Catherine said gently one afternoon, placing a hand on Margaret's shoulder as they walked through the courtyard. "But we must have faith. We must forgive. This is a test of our commitment to Christ's teachings. Your mother wouldn't want you to carry this burden of anger." "I know," Margaret replied quietly, but the words felt hollow in her mouth, like speaking a language she no longer understood. That evening, Margaret did something she hadn't done in 40 years. She left the convent after dark without permission. She told no one where she was going. She simply walked out the side door near the kitchen, wearing her habit, and disappeared into the humid New Orleans night. She walked through the French Quarter's narrow streets, past the tourists stumbling between bars on Bourbon Street, past the street performers playing jazz on corners, past the psychics and palm readers hawking their services to anyone who'd listen. The city pulsed with life and sin and joy and desperation, all mixed together in a uniquely New Orleans cocktail. Margaret had spent 40 years trying to ignore this world, to focus on the spiritual realm and leave earthly concerns behind. But tonight, she walked through it with new eyes, seeing it for what it really was, a place where power mattered, where strength determined outcomes, where the meek inherited nothing but contempt. She made her way to a grittier neighborhood near the Industrial Canal, where Rodrigo's construction company had its office and warehouse. The area was a mix of industrial buildings, corner stores with bars on the windows, and rundown houses. This wasn't tourist New Orleans, this was working-class New Orleans, where people struggled to make rent and keep their heads above water. The office was closed, but she could see lights on in the warehouse behind it. She heard men's voices, laughter, the sound of tools clanging, Spanish mixed with English. She stood in the shadows across the street, watching, waiting, her heart pounding but her breathing steady. After an hour, workers began leaving. She counted 9 men total, emerging in groups of 2 or 3, climbing into trucks and cars. One man caught her attention, a younger guy, maybe 30, with elaborate tattoos covering both arms. The ink depicted various religious imagery, mixed with gang symbols, a Virgin Mary next to a skull, a cross tangled with barbed wire. He wore a gold chain that glinted under the streetlights, and baggy jeans that hung low on his hips. He was laughing, showing something to his co-worker, tossing it carelessly in his hand. Margaret squinted, her heart pounding harder. In the dim light, she couldn't be absolutely certain, but it looked like he was holding beads, wooden beads on a chain. Her rosary, her mother's rosary, being handled like a toy, being shown off like a trophy. Margaret felt something snap inside her, like a rope pulled too tight for too long finally giving way. All the years of patience, of service, of swallowing her own needs and desires, of being told to be meek and mild, of having her feelings dismissed as unimportant. It all came crashing down. The carefully constructed wall between Sister Margaret the nun and Margaret the human being crumbled, and what emerged from the rubble was something the world hadn't seen in 40 years. Margaret Beaumont the woman, angry and done with forgiveness. She walked straight across the street, her habit billowing behind her in the humid breeze. Her shoes clicked on the pavement, steady and purposeful. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice steady and cold. The men turned, surprised to see a nun approaching them in this rough neighborhood at this late hour. They exchanged glances, some amused, some confused. "Yeah?" the tattooed man said, a smile playing at his lips. "You lost, sister. Church is that way." He gestured vaguely toward the French Quarter, and his friends laughed. "That rosary in your hand," Margaret said, pointing directly at him. "It belongs to me. You stole it from St. Augustine's convent on Tuesday afternoon." The man's expression shifted from amusement to annoyance. He glanced at the beads in his hand, then back at Margaret. "I didn't steal nothing, lady. Found these beads in the work truck. Probably trash someone left behind, finders keepers. Those beads are not trash, Margaret said, her voice dropping lower, taking on an edge that made one of the other men step back instinctively. They belong to my deceased mother. They've been in my family for 5 generations. I need them back, now. The tattooed man laughed, a cruel sound that cut through the humid air. Listen, lady, I don't know what you're talking about. These are mine now. Found property. You want 'em? You can buy 'em off me. Say, $50? His friends laughed harder, enjoying the show. Margaret took another step closer. She was within arm's reach now, this 62-year-old nun in her habit, facing down a man half her age and twice her size. I'm asking you one last time, return what you stole. Or what? Another man stepped forward, bigger than the first, with a shaved head and prison tattoos on his neck. What's a nun gonna do? Pray at us? Call God down to smite us? The group erupted in laughter, slapping each other's backs, thoroughly entertained by the situation. The tattooed man shoved the rosary into his pocket with deliberate disrespect. You should go back to your church, sister, he said, his tone mocking. Before you get hurt out here. This ain't your neighborhood. Shit happens to people who don't belong. Margaret looked at each of their faces. 9 men total, ranging from their 20s to their 50s. Hard men who worked with their hands, who'd probably done time, who saw the world as a place where the strong took what they wanted and the weak suffered what they must. They had no respect for her faith, her loss, her humanity. They were bullies, thieves, mockers. And in that moment, 40 years of suppressed rage found its focus and purpose. You're right, she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made the laughter die in their throats. This isn't my neighborhood, but you've made it my battlefield. The men laughed again, but this time it sounded more uncertain. There was something in Margaret's eyes, something in the way she stood that didn't match the image of a helpless old nun. The tattooed man waved her off dismissively. Whatever, crazy bitch. Go pray for us or whatever you nuns do. Margaret turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shadows. The men watched her go, already forgetting about the strange encounter, returning to their conversation about which bar they'd hit next. But Margaret hadn't forgotten. Margaret would never forget. What happened next would shock New Orleans and make headlines across the nation. But to understand how Sister Margaret Beaumont became a killer, you have to understand what years of suppression can do to the human soul, even one devoted to God. Margaret returned to the convent that night, slipping back in through the kitchen door. She went to her room, but she didn't sleep. She sat in the small chair by her window, looking out at the French Quarter's lights, not praying, but planning. Her mind worked with a clarity she hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever. It was as if removing the filter of her faith, the constant self-censorship of being a nun, had unlocked parts of her brain that had been dormant for decades. She thought about the layout of the construction company, the patterns of when workers arrived and left, the tools she'd seen in the warehouse. She thought about her years volunteering at Charity Hospital before it closed, and then at University Medical Center after Katrina. She'd spent countless hours with the dying, holding their hands, praying with them, but also learning. She'd learned about human anatomy from the doctors and nurses. She'd learned about where to apply pressure to stop bleeding, or where to cut to find specific arteries. She'd learned about the precise locations of major organs, about what injuries were survivable and what were fatal. She had spent decades helping people die with dignity, easing their passage from this world to the next. Now she would use that knowledge for a different purpose entirely. Friday morning, Margaret went about her normal duties with a calmness that surprised even herself. She taught catechism to a group of rowdy 10-year-olds, patiently explaining the significance of the Eucharist. She helped prepare lunch in the convent kitchen, chopping vegetables for the soup, while chatting with Sister Anne about the upcoming parish festival. She attended afternoon prayers, her lips moving through the familiar Latin phrases, her mind elsewhere entirely. Sister Catherine pulled her aside after dinner. You seem better today, she observed. More at peace. Have you made progress accepting what happened? I have, Margaret said, and it was true. She'd accepted that the systems designed to protect people like her, the police, the courts, even the church itself were useless. She'd accepted that justice would not come from official channels. She'd accepted that if she wanted her mother's rosary back, if she wanted the men who disrespected her to understand consequences, she would have to become the instrument of that justice herself. Catherine smiled, relieved. "I'm glad. Anger is poison to the soul, Margaret. You're doing the right thing by letting it go." Margaret smiled back, a serene expression that came easily after 40 years of practice. "You're right, Sister Catherine. Anger is poison. It has to be purged." That night, after the other sisters had gone to bed, Margaret changed out of her habit for the first time in 4 decades. She put on dark civilian clothes she'd taken from the convent's donation bin, black pants, a dark sweater, a baseball cap to cover her grey hair. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room and barely recognized the woman staring back. This wasn't Sister Margaret. This was just Margaret, a 62-year-old woman who'd been disrespected and dismissed one time too many. She left the convent again, this time carrying a bag. Inside were items she'd purchased earlier that day from a hardware store on the edge of the quarter. The clerk, a kid in his 20s absorbed in his phone, had barely glanced at her as she bought heavy-duty zip ties, a box cutter with replacement blades, industrial gloves, duct tape, and a small crowbar. She'd paid cash, kept her head down, and walked out without incident. By midnight, Margaret was positioned in an alley adjacent to Rodrigo's construction company. She'd spent the previous night observing, learning the patterns. The company had 2 night security guards who rotated shifts, but they were lazy, more interested in their phones than actual security. There was a 15-minute gap during the changeover, when the building was completely unmonitored. Additionally, she discovered that some workers stayed late several nights a week, using the warehouse for side jobs, cutting stolen metal pipes, working on personal projects, doing under-the-table work for cash. The warehouse had a side entrance that the workers propped open with a brick for easy access when they were doing these after-hours jobs. Rodrigo either didn't know or didn't care, as long as his workers showed up on time for the legitimate work. Margaret slipped inside during the shift change, her heart pounding but her hands steady. The warehouse was massive, full of construction materials, tools, equipment. She hid behind stacks of lumber in the back section, settling in to wait. The space smelled of sawdust, motor oil, and sweat. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating pools of harsh brightness separated by deep shadows. Around 1 a.m., she heard voices. 3 men entered through the side door, the tattooed man who'd stolen her rosary, plus 2 others she recognized from that night. They were setting up to cut metal pipes, probably stolen copper they planned to sell to a scrapyard for cash. They worked efficiently, clearly having done this many times before. "Marco, hand me the torch," the tattooed man, apparently named Marco, said to one of his companions. Yeah, hold on," Marco replied, a stocky guy in his 30s with a cigarette dangling from his lips. The third man, older with a beer gut and greying hair, was sorting through a pile of pipes. "We get this load done tonight. That's 300 each. Easy money." They were thieves, Margaret thought. Thieves working for a company run by a thief, stealing from other thieves in a chain of corruption that probably extended throughout New Orleans' construction industry. These were not good men. They were not innocent victims. They were predators who took what didn't belong to them and felt no remorse. Margaret watched from the shadows, her breathing controlled, her mind eerily calm. She'd put on the industrial gloves earlier, ensuring she'd leave no fingerprints. She gripped the box cutter in her right hand. She'd spent time earlier that day testing the blade on cardboard, learning the right angle and pressure to make clean, deep cuts. She'd practiced on old rope, on fabric, on various materials, teaching her 62-year-old hands to move with speed and precision. The men were focused on their work, arguing about measurements, passing a bottle of whiskey back and forth. None of them noticed when Margaret emerged from behind the lumber stack and approached the stocky man, Marco, who had his back turned to her, bent over a pipe. She moved with surprising speed for a woman her age. Decades of kneeling and standing during Mass, of working with children who ran circles around her, of physical labor in the convent gardens and kitchen, had kept her limbs flexible and strong. She grabbed Marco's hair from behind with her left hand, yanked his head back hard, and drew the blade across his throat in one fluid motion. The cut was deep and precise, severing the carotid artery and trachea in exactly the way she'd learned was most efficient from her years watching doctors work. Blood sprayed across the concrete floor in rhythmic spurts, following his heartbeat. Marco tried to scream, but only managed a wet, gurgling sound as his hands flew to his throat, trying desperately to hold back the tide of blood. He collapsed to his knees, then forward onto his face, convulsing as his brain was starved of oxygen. The other two men spun around, shock and horror transforming their faces. They saw their friend dying on the ground, blood spreading in a dark pool beneath him, and standing above him was Sister Margaret Beaumont, her face expressionless, the bloody box cutter in her gloved hand. "What the fuck?" the tattooed man screamed, his voice breaking with panic. "What the fuck?" "You should have returned my rosary," Margaret said, her voice unnaturally calm, almost conversational. The contrast between her tone and the violence she'd just committed was more terrifying than any screaming or rage would have been. The third man, the older one with the beer gut, showed more courage than sense. He grabbed a pipe wrench from the workbench and charged at Margaret, roaring in anger and fear. Margaret sidestepped with practiced ease, her body remembering movements from childhood, from playing with her brothers, from 40 years of working with energetic children who tested her reflexes daily. As the man stumbled past her, carried by his own momentum, she slashed the back of his thigh with surgical precision, cutting deep into the femoral artery. He went down screaming, clutching his leg as blood poured between his fingers. The artery pumped blood with each heartbeat, creating a spreading puddle beneath him. He looked up at Margaret with terror and incomprehension, unable to process that this nun, this old woman, had just delivered a wound that would kill him in minutes. The tattooed man was frozen, his brain unable to process what was happening. He'd seen violence before. He'd grown up in rough neighborhoods, done time in Louisiana State Penitentiary for assault. But this was different. This was a woman of God, a nun, standing calmly in a warehouse full of blood and dying men, holding a box cutter like it was a rosary. "Please," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Please, I got kids, I got a daughter." Margaret walked toward him slowly, deliberately, her shoes squelching in Marco's blood. "You have a daughter and you steal from nuns. You have a daughter and you mock a grieving woman. What kind of father are you?" The man's hand shook as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the rosary. The wooden beads caught the harsh fluorescent light. "Take it, just take it and leave. I'm sorry, okay, I'm sorry." He threw it toward her, and the rosary hit the blood-slicked floor, the beads scattering. Some slid into the pool of Marco's blood, the wood immediately soaking up the dark red liquid. Margaret knelt carefully, avoiding the spreading blood as much as possible, and gathered each bead, each piece of her mother's cherished prayer tool. She counted them meticulously, 59 beads in total plus the crucifix. All accounted for, though now they were splattered with the blood of men who had disrespected everything she held sacred. She tucked the rosary into her pocket, then looked up at the tattooed man. He was backing away, his hands held up in surrender, tears streaming down his face. "You had your chance to do the right thing," Margaret said, rising to her feet. "You chose mockery instead. You chose contempt. You treated my grief as entertainment and my faith as a joke." She advanced on him, the box cutter raised. "Now you'll learn that even God's servants have limits." "I said I was sorry," he screamed, still backing away, bumping into a workbench. "What more do you want?" "I want you to understand consequences," Margaret said. "For 40 years, I've watched men like you face no consequences for your actions. You steal, you mock, you disrespect, and the world just lets you. The police don't care. Your boss doesn't care. Society doesn't care. So someone has to make you care. Someone has to teach you that actions matter." What happened in that warehouse over the next hour would haunt the crime scene investigators who eventually processed it. The tattooed man, his name was Carlos Mendoza, Margaret would later learn, tried to run. But Margaret had locked the main doors from the inside during her initial entry. The side door he'd come through was blocked by lumber she'd quietly rearranged while waiting. He was trapped in this warehouse with a woman who'd spent 4 decades suppressing her rage, and that dam had finally burst. Margaret hunted him through the space like a patient predator. He tried to hide behind equipment, tried to find something to use as a weapon, tried to bargain and plead. But Margaret was methodical, calm, unhurried. She cornered him near the loading dock, where he'd finally run out of places to hide. This time she didn't grant him a quick death like Marco had received. She made him feel every cut, every slice, made him understand the pain of violation, of having something precious stolen and mocked. She asked him questions between cuts. Where is your daughter now? Does she know her father is a thief? Does she know you steal from nuns? Does she know you mock the grief of others? Carlos screamed answers, begged for mercy, promised to change. But Margaret was beyond mercy. She'd given mercy for 40 years. And where had it gotten her? Disrespected, dismissed, robbed. No more mercy, only justice. When it was finally over, 3 men lay dead in spreading pools of their own blood. Margaret stood among the bodies, breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from the release of emotions she'd suppressed for 4 decades. Her clothes were splattered with blood despite her attempts to minimize contact. Her gloves were soaked. But in her pocket, safe and recovered, was her mother's rosary. She should have felt horror at what she'd done. She should have felt guilt, remorse, shame. But all she felt was a profound sense of satisfaction, of completion. She'd taken back what was hers. She'd taught these men the lesson society had failed to teach them, that actions have consequences, that respect matters, that even the meek and mild can become terrible when pushed too far. Margaret carefully cleaned the box-cutter blade, wiped down the handle, and took it with her along with the zip ties and other tools she'd brought but hadn't needed. She removed her blood-soaked outer clothing, revealing clean, dark clothes underneath. She'd planned for this contingency. She rolled the bloody clothes into a tight bundle and placed them in her bag. She left through the side door, stepping carefully around the pooling blood, and disappeared into the New Orleans night. By the time she reached the French Quarter, dawn was breaking. Early morning workers were beginning their commutes. Street cleaners were hosing down Bourbon Street. The city was waking up, oblivious to the violence that had occurred just miles away. Margaret slipped back into the convent through the kitchen door. She went directly to her room, stripped off her remaining clothes, and placed everything into a trash bag. She washed herself thoroughly in the small bathroom she shared with 2 other sisters, scrubbing every inch of skin, watching the water run pink, then clear as the last traces of blood disappeared down the drain. She dressed in her habit, pinned her veil in place, and looked at herself in the mirror. Sister Margaret was back, looking exactly as she always had, calm, serene, peaceful. No one would ever know that just hours earlier she'd been someone else entirely. She retrieved her mother's rosary from where she'd hidden it and examined it closely. Several beads were stained dark with blood that had soaked into the porous wood. The crucifix had blood in its crevices. She spent the next hour painstakingly cleaning each bead with a wet cloth, working the blood out of the grain of the wood as much as possible. Some staining remained, giving the beads a slightly darker patina, but it wasn't obvious enough to draw attention. When Sister Catherine knocked on her door that morning, calling her to prayers, Margaret answered with a smile. "Coming, Sister Catherine." "Just finishing my morning meditation." At breakfast, the other nuns commented on how much better Margaret looked, how the tension seemed to have left her shoulders. Sister Anne said she seemed lighter somehow, more at peace. If only they knew the source of that peace. The discovery of the bodies at Rodrigo's construction company came that afternoon. The day shift workers had arrived to find the warehouse locked from the inside, which was unusual. When they finally gained entry through a window, they found a scene of carnage that would traumatize several of them for life. The New Orleans Police Department responded in force. Detective Sarah Broussard, a seasoned homicide investigator, was assigned to lead the case. At 42 years old, with 15 years in homicide, she'd seen her share of violent crime. New Orleans had one of the highest murder rates in the country, and she'd worked everything from gang shootings to domestic violence killings to drug-related executions. But when she walked into that warehouse and saw 3 men lying in massive pools of their own blood, all killed with precise cuts to major arteries, all positioned in ways that suggested they'd been hunted and terrorized before death, she knew this was different. "Jesus Christ," her partner, Detective Marcus Washington, breathed beside her. "What kind of monster does this?" Broussard studied the scene carefully. The kills showed sophistication, knowledge of human anatomy, understanding of which cuts would be fatal and which would cause suffering. The first victim, Marco Reyes, according to his ID, had died quickly from a severed carotid. The second, Tommy Boudreau, had bled out from a femoral artery cut. But the third, Carlos Mendoza, showed multiple wounds, defensive injuries on his hands and arms, cuts on his face and torso, before the final fatal wound to his throat. This wasn't rage, Broussard said, more to herself than to Washington. This was deliberate, calculated. The killer took their time with Mendoza, made him suffer. The crime scene techs were processing the warehouse, photographing everything, collecting blood samples, dusting for prints. Broussard noticed something on the floor near Mendoza's body, small wooden beads scattered in the blood. "Bag these," she told a tech, pointing at the beads. "Looks like a rosary or prayer beads, maybe." Over the next 48 hours, Broussard interviewed everyone connected to Rodrigo's construction company. She learned about the after-hours activities, the stolen materials, the under-the-table work. She learned that all three victims had criminal records. Marco had done time for burglary, Tommy for drug dealing, Carlos for assault and robbery. "They weren't choir boys," Washington observed. "Maybe this was retaliation for something they stole? A deal gone bad?" But Broussard wasn't convinced. The precision of the kill suggested someone with medical training or extensive anatomical knowledge. The scattered rosary beads suggested a religious element, and when she interviewed Rodrigo Martinez, a piece clicked into place. "Mr. Martinez, had your company had any disputes recently with clients or anyone else?" she asked. Rodrigo was pale, shaken. 3 of his workers were dead, killed in his warehouse. His business would likely never recover from this. No disputes. We do good work. People are happy." "No complaints at all?" "Well, there was this nun from St. Augustine's church. She called my office, said we stole something from her during a roof repair job. But I didn't think... they're nuns." Broussard leaned forward, her instincts firing. What did this nun say was stolen? "A rosary. She said it belonged to her dead mother, had sentimental value. But I told her my guys didn't take nothing. She probably just lost it." "When did this conversation happen?" "Maybe a week ago," the head nun called. "She was pretty insistent, but I told her I couldn't help her. My guys are honest workers." Broussard exchanged a glance with Washington. "Do you know which of your workers was at St. Augustine's for that job?" Rodrigo consulted his records. "Let's see. Marco Reyes, Tommy Boudreau, and..." His face went white. "Carlos Mendoza, along with 6 others. 3 victims, all present at the church when a rosary went missing. Rosary beads found at the murder scene. This wasn't a coincidence." "I need the names of the other 6 workers who were at that job," Broussard said, feeling a chill run down her spine. Within hours, she and a team of officers were at St. Augustine's convent, requesting to speak with Sister Margaret Beaumont. Sister Catherine met them at the door, her confusion genuine and evident. "Sister Margaret, you think Sister Margaret has something to do with those horrible murders? That's insane. She's the gentlest person I've ever known. She wouldn't hurt anyone." But Broussard had learned over her years in homicide that the deadliest people were often those you'd least expect. "We still need to speak with her." Catherine led them through the convent, a building that had stood since the 1700s, full of history and prayer and devotion. They found Margaret in her room reading scripture, looking every inch the devoted nun. "Good afternoon, officers," Margaret said politely, setting down her Bible. "How can I help you?" Broussard studied her face carefully. This woman was 62 years old, slight of build with grey hair and gentle eyes. She looked like someone's grandmother, not a killer. "Sister Margaret, we're investigating the murders at Rodrigo's construction company. We understand you had a complaint about a stolen rosary." "Yes," Margaret said, genuine sadness crossing her face. "My mother's rosary was taken during a roof repair. It meant the world to me. It's been in my family for generations. But Officer Dupree said there was nothing the police could do." "Did you ever go to the construction company yourself? Try to recover the rosary on your own?" "No, Detective. Sister Catherine handled all the communications with the company. I was too upset to speak with them directly. Losing my mother's rosary was heartbreaking, but I've been trying to accept it as God's will." "But you haven't accepted it, have you?" Broussard pressed. watching for any reaction. "You must be angry about it." Margaret's expression remained calm, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something dark that came and went so quickly Broussard almost missed it. "Anger is a sin, detective. I've spent 40 years learning to let go of such emotions. What good would anger do me?" Sister Catherine stepped forward, defensive. "Detective, I can account for Sister Margaret's whereabouts. She's been here every evening, attending prayers with the rest of us, fulfilling her duties. She hasn't left the convent grounds." Broussard wasn't ready to give up yet. "Sister Margaret, would you mind if we searched your room?" "Of course not," Margaret said, stepping aside graciously. "Please look anywhere you'd like. I have nothing to hide." The officers searched thoroughly, checking drawers under the bed, in the wardrobe, even inside her prayer books. They found nothing suspicious. No bloody clothing, no weapons, no sign that Sister Margaret was anything other than what she appeared to be. As they were preparing to leave, Broussard noticed something on Margaret's nightstand, a wooden rosary. "Is that the rosary that was stolen?" Margaret's face brightened slightly. "Oh no, this is a new one. One of our parishioners heard about what happened and gave it to me. She left it in my room with a sweet note saying she was sorry for my loss. It's not the same as my mother's, but it helps me pray. It helps me feel connected to my faith during this difficult time." Broussard picked up the rosary, examining it closely. The beads were wooden, worn smooth from use. But as she held it up to the light streaming through the window, she noticed something. Tiny dark spots in the grain of the wood. Spots that looked like they could be stains. Bloodstains, perhaps, worked deep into the porous wood where cleaning couldn't reach. "Sister Margaret," Broussard said slowly, carefully, "where exactly did you say you got this rosary?" Margaret's serene expression never wavered, not even for a second. "As I said, a parishioner gave it to me. She didn't leave her name. It was just in my room one morning with a note." Such a thoughtful gesture during my time of grief. Broussard's instincts were screaming that something was wrong, but she had no proof, no concrete evidence. Just suspicion and some dark spots on wooden beads that could be anything. "We'll need to take this for testing." "Of course," Margaret said easily, "but I do hope I get it back eventually. It's become quite special to me. It's helped me through this difficult time." Broussard bagged the rosary as evidence and left with her team, her mind racing. Something about Sister Margaret bothered her, but she couldn't put her finger on what exactly. The woman was too calm, too composed, too perfect in her responses. "You really think a 62-year-old nun killed 3 grown men?" Washington asked as they drove back to the station. "I don't know what I think yet," Broussard admitted. "But those beads at the crime scene, the rosary in her room, the timing, it's too many coincidences." Back at the police lab, forensic testing revealed Broussard's instincts were right. The rosary was covered in blood, minute traces in the grain of the wood, more substantial amounts in the crevices of the crucifix. DNA testing was rushed, and the results came back matching all 3 victims. This wasn't a gift from a parishioner. This was the stolen rosary, retrieved from Carlos Mendoza's pocket and cleaned but not perfectly. But there was a significant problem with building a case. The rosary had been in Margaret's possession, in her locked room at the convent, with Sister Catherine and other nuns providing alibis for Margaret's whereabouts during the estimated times of the murders. The convent had strict rules. Sisters didn't leave after dark without permission and accompaniment. According to Catherine and the other nuns, Margaret had been present for evening prayers all 3 nights the murders occurred. How could she have killed 3 men when she never left the building? The answer came from an unexpected source. Broussard returned to the neighborhood around Rodrigo's construction company, canvassing more thoroughly. She showed Margaret's photo, one from the church website showing her smiling gently in her habit, to shopkeepers and residents. An elderly man who ran a corner store 2 blocks from the warehouse recognized her. "Yeah, I seen her. Not dressed like that, though. She was wearing regular clothes. Dark-colored. Had a bag with her. Walked past here 3 nights in a row late, like after midnight." "You're sure it was her?" "Pretty sure. I don't forget faces, detective. Been running this store 40 years. You see a nun out of her costume at that hour. It sticks in your mind." Broussard obtained security footage from the liquor store across from the warehouse. The footage was grainy. The cameras old, but it showed a figure matching Margaret's height and build entering the alley beside the warehouse on 3 separate nights, the nights of the murders. Armed with this evidence, Broussard got a warrant for a more thorough search of the convent. This time they brought dogs trained to detect blood. The dogs alerted on the basement, specifically the donation bin. Buried beneath layers of donated clothing, they found dark pants and a sweater with trace amounts of blood that matched the victims. In Margaret's room, a more careful search revealed a loose floorboard. Hidden in the space beneath were zip ties still in their packaging, a box cutter with replacement blades and industrial gloves, all purchased from a hardware store whose security footage showed Margaret making the purchase, paying cash, keeping her head down, but not quite enough to hide her face completely from the camera. Most damning of all was Margaret's journal. She'd kept detailed records of her spiritual life for years, writing daily reflections on scripture, prayers, and her service to God. But the most recent entries told a different story entirely. She'd documented everything: her rage at the theft, her planning, her observation of the warehouse and workers' patterns, her preparation and purchase of tools, and finally, her execution of each murder. The entries were chilling in their clinical detail. She described approaching Marco from behind, the exact angle of the cut, the way his blood had sprayed in arterial spurts. She described hunting Carlos through the warehouse, the questions she'd asked him between cuts, the satisfaction she'd felt when he finally understood that his mockery had consequences. She'd written it all down in careful, precise script, as if documenting a spiritual journey rather than brutal murders. It wasn't anger that guided my hand. One entry read, "It was clarity. For 40 years I've been told that my feelings don't matter, that I should forgive endless trespasses, that being meek is a virtue. But Christ also drove the money changers from the temple with a whip. There is a time for mercy and a time for judgment. These men had their chance at mercy. They chose mockery instead." Another entry, written after the first 3 killings. "I retrieved my mother's rosary tonight. The beads were in Carlos's pocket, treated like trash. I've cleaned them as best I can, though some blood has soaked deep into the wood. Perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps my mother's prayers are now mixed with the blood of men who learned too late that sacred things deserve respect. I feel no guilt. I feel only peace. The pressure that's built inside me for 4 decades has been released. I can breathe again." When Broussard confronted Margaret with the evidence, the journal, the bloody clothes, the tools, the security footage, the witness identifications, the nun's peaceful facade finally cracked. Not with panic or denial, but with something more unsettling, a small, satisfied smile. "Did you kill Marco Reyes? Thomas Boudreau and Carlos Mendoza?" Broussard asked, the interview room's camera recording everything. Margaret looked directly at the detective, her grey eyes clear and calm. I did what was necessary to retrieve my mother's rosary and to punish those who mocked what is sacred. They stole from me, Detective Broussard, not just a rosary, but my dignity, my connection to my mother, my right to grief. They laughed at my pain. They treated my faith as a joke, and when I asked them to return what they'd stolen, they mocked me further." "So you killed them," Broussard said, still struggling to reconcile this calm, articulate woman with the brutality of the crime scenes. "I executed them," Margaret corrected gently. "There's a difference. Killing suggests impulsive violence. What I did was deliberate judgment. For 40 years, Detective, I've been told to be meek, to be mild, to turn the other cheek. I've swallowed every insult, every dismissal, every moment of being treated as if my feelings don't matter because I'm a woman, because I'm a nun, because I'm supposed to be above such earthly concerns." She leaned forward slightly. And Broussard saw something fierce and terrifying in her eyes. "Those men stole from me, mocked me, and thought they could do so without consequence because of what I am. They were wrong. I am not just a nun. I am a woman whose mother is dead, whose connection to her past was violated, whose faith was disrespected. And I made them understand the cost of that disrespect. I made them feel it before they died." Broussard felt a chill run through her. "You murdered 3 people over a rosary." "I punished 3 thieves and mockers who violated sacred ground," Margaret said, her voice steady. "And Detective, if you're thorough in your investigation, you'll find I'm not done yet." The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Broussard's blood ran cold. "What do you mean you're not done?" Margaret smiled that serene smile again. "There were 9 workers at St. Augustine's that day. 3 are dead, 6 remain. Do you really think I'd stop before finishing what I started?" Broussard immediately dispatched officers to locate and protect the remaining 6 workers from the roof repair job, but she was too late for 3 of them. Roberto Salazar was found in his apartment in Metairie, killed in the same methodical manner as the first 3 victims. Time of death was estimated at 2 nights prior, before the police had even identified Margaret as a suspect. His throat had been cut with surgical precision, and he'd been left positioned on his knees, hands clasped as if in prayer, his own blood pooling beneath him. Miguel Santos was discovered in his truck in a Walmart parking lot in Kenner. He'd been ambushed as he left his late shift at a warehouse job. The kill was efficient, a single deep cut to the femoral artery. He'd bled out in his truck, and no one had noticed until the morning when other workers arrived. Again, this had happened before police identified Margaret. Diego Hernandez was found in the construction company's supply shed, where he'd gone to retrieve materials for a job. He'd been killed the previous afternoon, his body hidden behind stacks of drywall. This one showed more rage, multiple cuts, defensive wounds, signs that he'd fought hard before Margaret had finally delivered the killing blow. 3 more men dead, all killed while Sister Margaret had seemingly been going about her normal duties at the convent. How was she doing this? The answer came when Broussard examined the timeline more carefully. Margaret hadn't been leaving every night. She'd been strategic, choosing nights when she knew she could slip out and return without being missed. The convent's evening prayers ended at 8 p.m., and the sisters were supposed to retire to their rooms afterward, but there was no actual bed check, no enforcement of their presence. As long as Margaret attended morning prayers at 6 a.m., no one verified where she'd been during the night. The other nuns had assumed she was in her room praying or sleeping. They'd provided alibis based on that assumption, not actual verification of her presence. Margaret had exploited the trust of her community, using their faith in her to commit murder. "She played us," Washington said, looking at crime scene photos of the latest victims. "She played everyone. Sweet old nun who'd never hurt a fly. Meanwhile, she's hunting down workers like she's some kind of avenging angel." Broussard put out an APB for the remaining 3 workers: Fernando Cruz, Antonio Ramirez, and Jose Fuentes. All 3 were located within hours and placed under police protection. They were terrified, suddenly understanding that the strange nun who'd confronted them that night had systematically killed 6 of their co-workers. "She's crazy," Fernando said, his hands shaking as he sat in the police station's protective custody area. "She looked like somebody's grandma, but her eyes... Man, her eyes were cold, like looking at death." "Did any of you take her rosary?" Broussard asked. The 3 men exchanged glances. Antonio spoke up, his voice shaky. "Carlos had it. He found it in one of the rooms we were working in. We told him to turn it in, but he said finders keepers. We didn't think it was a big deal, just some old prayer beads. When she confronted you that night, why didn't you return it?" Fernando looked down at his hands. "Because we're assholes, okay? We thought it was funny, some old nun getting mad about beads. We laughed at her. Carlos told her to get lost. We had no idea she'd... Jesus Christ, 6 people are dead." "Technically 7, Broussard corrected. "You're forgetting Tommy, Marco, and Carlos. And if Sister Margaret had her way, it would be 9. Jose started crying. "I got kids, man. I got 3 kids. I can't die because Carlos was stupid enough to steal from a nun." But Margaret was done hunting. With police aware of her crimes and the remaining workers under protection, she couldn't reach them. Instead, she did something that shocked everyone. She turned herself in. She walked into the police station 2 days after being identified as the suspect, wearing her full habit, carrying nothing but her mother's rosary. The desk sergeant almost didn't recognize her as a wanted murderer, until she calmly stated, "My name is Sister Margaret Beaumont. I'm here to confess to 6 murders and 3 attempted murders. I would have completed all 9, but you've protected the last 3. That's unfortunate, but I accept God's will in this." Broussard was called in immediately. She found Margaret sitting calmly in an interview room, the rosary in her hands, her fingers moving over the blood-stained beads, as she prayed silently. "Sister Margaret, you understand you're under arrest for murder." "Of course, Detective. I'm here to take responsibility for my actions. I'm not insane. I knew exactly what I was doing, and I'd do it again if given the chance." The interrogation that followed was recorded and would later be played in court. Margaret showed no remorse, no regret, only a calm certainty that what she'd done was justified. "They violated sacred space," she explained patiently, as if teaching a particularly slow child. "They stole from a servant of God, mocked her grief and felt no consequences. Society had failed to teach them respect, so I became their teacher. Each death was a lesson. Respect the sacred, respect grief, respect those you dismiss as powerless." "You're a nun," Broussard said, still trying to understand. "You devoted your life to God, to peace, to helping people. How do you reconcile murdering 6 people with your faith?" Margaret smiled, that serene expression that Broussard had come to find more disturbing than any show of rage. "Detective, have you read the Old Testament? God commanded the Israelites to slaughter entire cities, men, women, children, livestock. God sent plagues, floods, fire from heaven. God is not just love and mercy. God is also judgment and wrath. I was made in God's image, which means I contain the capacity for both mercy and judgment. For 40 years I showed only mercy. These men received my judgment. That's not how the law works. That's not how society works." "No," Margaret agreed. "Society's way allows men like Carlos and Marco and the others to steal, mock, and disrespect without consequence. They had arrest records, Detective. Multiple arrests for theft, assault, drug dealing. And what happened? Slaps on the wrist, probation. They learned that actions don't really have consequences. I taught them otherwise. By killing them. By showing them that there are still people in this world who will enforce consequences when the system fails to do so." The trial of Sister Margaret Beaumont became a national sensation. The media couldn't get enough of the story. "Killer nun, the Rosary murders, God's avenging angel," screamed the headlines. News trucks camped outside St. Augustine's church. Reporters harassed the other nuns, trying to get inside information about Margaret's state of mind. The prosecution was led by District Attorney James Thornton, a career prosecutor with political ambitions. He saw this case as his ticket to higher office: convict the killer nun, show the public that no one is above the law, ride the publicity to a run for Attorney General. He painted Margaret as a cold-blooded murderer who'd used her position and appearance to evade suspicion while committing horrific crimes. He brought in the families of the victims: Marco's elderly mother, who wept on the stand; Tommy's teenage daughter, who'd lost her father; Carlos's wife and children who'd been left without support. These weren't abstractions, Thornton told the jury during his opening statement. These were real people with families who loved them. Yes, they made mistakes. Yes, they stole a rosary. That doesn't justify what this woman did to them. She hunted them like animals, made them suffer, and killed them with a precision that shows how calculating and remorseless she truly is. The defense was led by Public Defender Maria Santos, an overworked lawyer who'd pulled this assignment and initially considered it hopeless. How do you defend someone who'd confessed in detail, who showed no remorse, whose crimes were documented in her own handwriting? But as Maria dug into Margaret's background, talked with her at length, and researched the psychological effects of long-term emotional suppression, she found an angle. She couldn't argue innocence. Margaret was clearly guilty. But she could argue for understanding, for context, for recognition that this case was more complex than evil nun kills innocent workers. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Maria said in her opening statement, "I'm not going to tell you Sister Margaret is innocent. She's not. She killed 6 people and she'd tell you that herself. But I'm going to ask you to understand why. I'm going to ask you to look at what 40 years of forced emotional suppression does to the human psyche. I'm going to ask you to consider what happens when society tells women, especially women of faith, that their feelings don't matter, that they should endlessly forgive, that standing up for themselves is sinful." She brought in psychiatrists who testified about the psychological effects of long-term emotional denial. Dr. Patricia Williams, a specialist in religious trauma, explained how religious institutions often create environments where natural human emotions are labeled as sins. Sister Margaret spent 4 decades being told that anger was wrong, that asserting her needs was prideful, that suffering in silence was holy, Dr. Williams testified. Psychologically, this creates enormous internal pressure. Every insult she swallowed, every dismissal she accepted, every moment she denied her own legitimate feelings, it all accumulated like water behind a dam. When that dam broke, the result was catastrophic. The prosecution countered with their own experts, who testified that Margaret was fully competent, understood right from wrong, and had planned these murders with clear intent and premeditation. Sister Catherine testified, tearfully describing Margaret as the kindest, most dedicated servant of God she'd ever known. "I've known her for 20 years, Catherine said, wiping her eyes. She was patient with difficult children, gentle with dying patients, never raised her voice, never showed anger. I had no idea she was capable of this. But looking back, I wonder if we failed her. We are so much of our sisters. Endless patience, endless forgiveness, endless self-denial. We never gave her space to be angry, to be hurt, to be human." Other nuns testified similarly, painting a picture of a woman who'd been the perfect nun, but perhaps at the cost of her own mental health. The prosecution brought in the 3 surviving workers, Fernando, Antonio, and Jose, who testified about that night when Margaret had confronted them, the coldness in her eyes, the terror they'd felt when they realized she was serious. "She didn't seem crazy," Fernando testified. "That was the scariest part. She was calm, controlled, like she'd thought everything through. When she told us we'd made her battlefield, I got chills. She meant it. She was going to kill all of us if she could." The forensic evidence was overwhelming and undisputed. Blood spatter analysis, DNA evidence, Margaret's detailed journal entries, it all pointed to methodical, planned murders executed with chilling precision. Margaret herself took the stand against her lawyer's advice. She wanted to speak, to explain herself to the world. "Do you regret what you did?" Thornton asked during cross-examination. "I regret that I lived 40 years denying my own humanity in service to an ideal that left me vulnerable to men who respect nothing," Margaret said, her voice steady and clear. "I regret that the systems designed to protect people like me, the police, the courts, even my own church, were useless when I needed them. But I don't regret making those men pay for their disrespect. I don't regret teaching them the lesson society failed to teach." "You murdered 6 people over a rosary." "I executed 6 criminals who violated sacred ground, mocked a grieving woman, and thought they'd face no consequences. Each of them had arrest records, Mr. Thornton. Each of them had stolen before, hurt people before, faced the justice system before, and been released to offend again. I was simply more effective than your courts." The courtroom erupted. The judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Margaret sat calmly through it all, her hands folded, her expression serene. "Do you feel any remorse for the families you've destroyed?" Thornton pressed. "I feel sorry for them," Margaret said. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love. But their grief doesn't negate my right to justice. Their loved ones stole from me, mocked me, disrespected my faith and my loss. Actions have consequences. I'm sorry the consequences affected innocent family members, but that's the nature of consequences." "You're a nun," Thornton said, his voice rising with genuine anger. "You took vows to serve God, to help people, to be an instrument of peace. How can you stand there and justify cold-blooded murder?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "I'm also a human being, Mr. Thornton. I'm a woman whose mother died, whose grief was dismissed, whose faith was mocked. For 40 years I was Sister Margaret the nun, denying every natural human emotion. For 4 nights I was Margaret the woman, reclaiming what was mine and enforcing the consequences your system failed to enforce. Both versions are equally real. Both are equally me. The tragedy is that I felt I could only be fully human when I was taking lives rather than serving them. The jury deliberated for 4 days. The evidence was overwhelming, but some jurors struggled with the context, with the psychological testimony, with the question of whether years of suppression could be considered a mitigating factor. Ultimately, they found Sister Margaret Beaumont guilty on all 6 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was unanimous, though several jurors were crying as they announced it. The sentencing hearing was equally dramatic. The judge, a Catholic himself named Harold Martinez, no relation to Rodrigo, struggled visibly with what he had to do. "Sister Margaret," he said, his voice heavy, "in my 30 years on the bench, I've never encountered a case quite like this. You are clearly intelligent, articulate, and fully aware of your actions. The brutality of your crimes is shocking, especially coming from someone who devoted her life to God and peace. And yet, I cannot ignore the psychological testimony, the evidence of what 40 years of emotional suppression did to you." He paused, looking at her with something like sadness. "But the law is clear. You committed 6 premeditated murders. You hunted these men systematically, made them suffer, and showed no remorse. I hereby sentence you to 6 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole." Margaret accepted the sentence with the same calm she'd shown throughout the trial. As the bailiffs led her from the courtroom, she clutched her mother's rosary, returned to her as personal property after the trial concluded. She'd cleaned it meticulously before the trial, removing every visible trace of blood from the wooden beads, though microscopic analysis would always show the stains embedded deep in the wood. In prison at Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, Margaret became a model inmate almost immediately. She taught literacy classes to other inmates, many of whom had never finished school. She counseled women struggling with addiction, trauma, and the violence that had landed them behind bars. She led prayer groups and Bible studies that were remarkably well attended. The guards and other prisoners found her to be exactly what one would expect of a nun: kind, patient, wise, endlessly compassionate. Many couldn't reconcile the gentle woman who helped them work through their problems with the killer who'd brutally murdered 6 men. Teresa Williams, a corrections officer, who'd been working at the prison for 15 years, developed a cautious friendship with Margaret over time. Teresa had grown up Catholic, had considered becoming a nun herself before choosing a different path. She was drawn to Margaret despite knowing her crimes, fascinated by the contradiction. One day, about 2 years into Margaret's sentence, Teresa worked up the courage to ask the question everyone wondered: "How can you be so peaceful, so kind to everyone here, after what you did?" Margaret looked up from the rosary she was praying, her weathered fingers moving over the familiar beads. They were sitting in a quiet corner of the prison chapel, a space that had become Margaret's domain. "Because I'm no longer suppressing who I am," Margaret said simply. "For 40 years I buried my anger, my pain, my needs beneath layers of piety and obedience. It festered, grew toxic, until it exploded in violence. Now, having released that poison, I can be genuinely kind again. I can serve God and help these women without the burden of unexpressed rage building inside me." "But you killed 6 people, Teresa said, still struggling to understand. "How do you live with that?" "I carry it with me every day," Margaret acknowledged. "I see their faces sometimes in my dreams, especially Carlos. I made him suffer the most, and I remember every cut, every scream, every moment of his terror. But they stole from me, Teresa, not just a rosary, but my dignity, my right to grief, my connection to my mother. They mocked my faith and thought they'd face no consequences because I was just a harmless old nun." She fingered the beads thoughtfully. "I taught them otherwise. I showed them that even the meekest servant of God has limits. I'm at peace with that. I wish there had been another way, but the systems that should have protected me, the police, the courts, even my own church, all failed. So I became the system. I became justice." Teresa shook her head, still troubled. "I still don't understand how you reconcile that with your faith." "Thou shalt not kill is pretty clear." Margaret smiled. That serene expression Teresa found more unsettling than any display of anger. "The Bible is full of killing done in God's name, Teresa. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son. Moses led the Israelites in wars that killed thousands. King David was a warrior who slaughtered his enemies and danced in their blood. God himself killed the firstborn of Egypt, drowned Pharaoh's army, rained fire on Sodom and Gomorrah." She continued, her voice taking on a teaching tone that reminded Teresa of catechism classes from childhood. "We're taught that God is love, and that's true. But God is also wrathful, judgmental, punishing. The Old Testament God demands blood sacrifice, orders genocides, strikes people dead for disobedience. For 40 years, I focused only on the love, the mercy, the forgiveness. But I am made in God's image, which means I contain the capacity for wrath as well." "So you think God approved of what you did?" "I think God understands," Margaret said carefully. "I think God knows what it's like to see his temple violated, his sacred things treated with contempt, his servants mocked and dismissed. I think God knows what it's like to enforce consequences when mercy has been rejected. Whether he approved? That's between him and me. I'll find out when I die." Teresa stood to leave, her head spinning from the conversation. At the door, she turned back. "Do you pray for them? For the men you killed?" Margaret nodded. "Every day. I pray for their souls, for their families, for forgiveness if God sees fit to grant it. But I also pray in thanksgiving that I was strong enough to do what needed to be done, that I honored my mother's memory, that I taught a lesson about respecting the sacred. My prayers are complicated now, Teresa. They're no longer just the simple devotions of a nun. They're the prayers of a woman who's lived fully, in service and in judgment, in mercy and in wrath." The story of Sister Margaret Beaumont sparked national debates that continued for years. Women's groups discussed the expectations placed on women to be endlessly forgiving and accommodating. Religious scholars debated whether Margaret's interpretation of Scripture had any theological merit. Psychologists studied her case, using it to illustrate the dangers of long-term emotional suppression. Legal experts argued about whether the psychological testimony should have resulted in a lesser sentence. Some saw her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of repressing emotion in the name of spiritual devotion. Others saw her as simply a murderer who used her trauma as an excuse for brutal violence. Margaret herself remained indifferent to these debates, focused on her work in the prison, helping other women, praying her rosary. 5 years into her sentence, Margaret developed lung cancer. The doctors determined it was likely from years of exposure to incense smoke in poorly ventilated churches, combined with the mold and dampness that plagued old buildings like the convent. The cancer was aggressive, already metastasized to her lymph nodes and liver by the time it was diagnosed. She declined aggressive treatment, stating that she'd lived long enough and was ready to meet her maker. "I'm 67 years old," she told the prison doctor. "I've served God for 40 years and served justice for 4 nights. I've spent 5 years helping the women here find peace and purpose. I'm content with what I've done with my life, all of it, the good and the terrible. I'm ready to face whatever judgment awaits me." She spent her final months in the prison infirmary, her body weakening but her mind sharp until the end. Inmates came to visit her, some to say goodbye, others to seek final counsel or prayer. Teresa visited almost daily, still trying to understand the woman who'd been both saint and killer. Margaret spent hours praying her mother's rosary, her fingers moving over the blood-stained beads she'd killed to reclaim. The prison chaplain, Father Miguel Rodriguez, came often to sit with her. He'd been fascinated and disturbed by Margaret since she'd arrived, this nun who'd killed 6 men and showed no remorse. "Are you afraid?" he asked one day, as Margaret's breathing grew more labored, her skin taking on the waxy appearance of approaching death. "No," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm curious. I've spent my whole life believing in God, in an afterlife, in divine judgment. Now I'll know if I was right. I'll stand before God and hear his verdict on my life. Not the court's verdict, not society's verdict, but God's. What do you think he'll say?" Margaret smiled weakly. "I think he'll say I was fully human, capable of great compassion and terrible violence, of selfless service and calculated vengeance. I think he'll say I was made in his image more truly in those 4 nights than in the 40 years I spent trying to be something I wasn't. But we'll see." Father Rodriguez leaned closer. "Do you want to make a final confession, to seek absolution for the murders?" "Yes." Margaret considered this for a long moment. "No, Father. To confess would be to express regret, to wish I'd done differently. I don't wish that. Those men needed to learn respect for the sacred, and I was the instrument of that lesson. I'll face God's judgment for it, but I won't apologize for it." On her deathbed, with only hours left, a small group gathered around her. Teresa, Father Rodriguez, 2 inmates who'd become close to Margaret, and, surprisingly, Sister Catherine, who'd continued to visit Margaret throughout her incarceration despite the scandal it caused. Catherine held Margaret's hand, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry we created an environment where you couldn't express your pain, your anger, your humanity. I'm sorry the church failed you." Margaret squeezed her hand weakly. "You didn't fail me, Catherine. The church didn't fail me. I failed myself by trying to be perfect instead of real. But I'm real now. In these last years, helping these women, I've been more genuinely myself than in 40 years of denying who I was." "But at what cost?" Catherine asked, her voice breaking. "At the cost of 6 lives," Margaret said honestly. "At the cost of my freedom, my reputation, my place in the church, but also at the gain of my humanity, my authenticity, my peace. The balance sheet is complicated, Catherine. Only God can judge whether it came out even." As the morphine drip took her deeper into unconsciousness, Father Rodriguez asked if she had any final words, any message she wanted to convey to the world. Margaret's eyes fluttered open one last time. Her breath was shallow, her words slurred, but everyone leaned in to hear. "Tell them. Tell them that even the gentlest soul can become a weapon when pushed far enough. Tell them that respect isn't just for those with power, but for everyone, even an old nun with a simple rosary. Tell them that I go to my judgment without regret, carrying my mother's beads, knowing that I honored her memory in the only way those men would understand." She paused, gathering strength for her final words. "And tell them that I was a good nun for 40 years and a good K.